All right, it is 6:03 p.m. and it is time to call the Community Development Committee meeting to order. Would you like to make a motion for a 5-minute recess?
Yep.
Councilmember Mayhew.
Move that we go on a 5-minute recess.
All right. Then we'll go into a 5-minute recess.
What?
Thank you. So we are back in session. We're going to go ahead and go forward with the meeting at this time. So Councilmember Mayhew, having reviewed the agenda, do you have any objections or concerns?
I do not. Just we may want to note that you and I are present and Councilmember Johnson is not currently.
Yep.
For roll call.
Okay. And for CD, who typically takes roll?
Chair.
The chair. Okay. All right.
So I think you just did it.
All right. In that case, noted. This time we typically ask whether there are any members of the public who would like to speak to an item that is not on the agenda. At this point this evening, I do not see any members of the public in City Hall. I'll look quickly to see whether there are any members of the public online at this time. There are no members of the public online, so we'll go ahead and move forward. The next item on the agenda is going to be the approval of the minutes dated August 21st of 2023. Are there any concerns or revisions to the minutes?
None for me.
Okay, hearing none, the minutes are approved. The next item up on the agenda is going to be the discussion item. This is the human services discussion. So Carson, I assume you're here to speak to us on that?
Yep.
Lovely.
All right. Good evening, committee members. Carson Hornsby, management analyst. I'm also the staff liaison to our Human Services Advisory Committee. I'm here tonight just to have a brief discussion with all of you on human services. We recently had, or the Human Services Advisory Committee recently had the first review of accountability forms for this biennium in the month of August. Councilmember Mayhew, as our council liaison, was present at that meeting. He made the request of me to show up at a future Community Development Committee meeting just to talk about some of these processes that happen behind the scenes and talk about our accountability reporting process. So before I get into some more detail on the accountability forms, I wanted to just kind of refresh memories on our program as a whole and talk about some of the competitive funding application process and the processes that have happened up to this current point in the biennium. So the Human Services Advisory Committee was created as a special advisory committee to the mayor. And the mayor appoints each member of the committee. Our current members are Sarah Weisel and Jennifer Bragg. We recently had a resignation by a longtime member, Carol Peterson. She resigned for some personal reasons, but I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge some of her contributions over the years. I've been in this position and with the city for 4 years, little over 4 years now, and she's been on the advisory committee for that entire time, plus several years earlier. So she's had a long tenure of working with the city to identify funding needs in the community and really make sure that this process is implemented efficiently and that needs are being met in the community. So thank you to Carol for all her years of hard work. So the advisory committee as a whole, their goal is to work with staff to identify funding priorities and needs in the community, to administer the competitive funding application process that we went through at the end of 2022. They recommend budget allocations based on this process to the Community Development Committee and the City Council as a whole. And then throughout the biennium, four times, they review accountability reports from organizations to ensure efficient use of city funds. So the application process for this current biennium took place at the end of 2022. We had 15 total applications. 13 of those applications were approved for funding for this biennium. And In order to receive funding under our current funding priorities, the organizations must meet one of these priorities that are up on screen. They include food to eat and a roof overhead, supporting and preparing youth for success, a safe haven from violence and abuse, and physical and mental wellness and healthy aging. So up on screen, right? It's like this is frozen.
It was freezing in the last meeting as well. But it did eventually come along.
Maybe just give it a sec here.
We'll go ahead and let the record reflect that Councilmember Johnson is here as well.
So maybe I could just make a comment now while we're waiting for this slide to advance. If I just take you guys back about 4 years ago, oh shoot, it went away.
I just disconnected from the
Oh.
meeting.
To try
Could be
okay.
poor connection, so.
So the priorities could be up there, the 4 priorities. So if you go back 4 years ago, we had organizations applying for human services funding, but there really wasn't as structured of a framework to evaluate the requests. So it's like, so the discussion sort of went, as you might imagine, well, these, organization A wants some money, they do good work. G, maybe we should, fund them. And sort of the discussion was, well, okay, a lot of organizations do good work. Is that really, can we have better criteria or more specific criteria than that would guide us? And out of that conversation came kind of a concern that, hey, actually, when we look at this, do we fund a whole bunch of organizations that are actually doing essentially the same thing? Some people use the word competing with each other, although I think that was taking the concept. I don't think they compete per se, but I still get the notion or certainly understand the notion, which is, hey, if we kind of focus on a few organizations, maybe we deliver better to the community. So the idea was, all right, well, how do we solve all that? And this committee did a ton of work to come up with those 4 funding priorities. That's those are unique to Snoqualmie.
Okay.
They looked at funding priorities that I think they looked at about a dozen cities. They looked at there's some consortiums that do this of small cities where they sort of get together and they do combined applications and so on. They looked at the criteria those guys use. But a lot of it, they said, doesn't apply that much to Snoqualmie. We're unique, right? We are where we are. We're not somewhere else. We're not Seattle. City of Seattle is going to have a bunch of issues that we don't have. We have some issues that maybe Seattle doesn't have. Maybe we think about, what happens with youth in the forests around here. Well, yeah, they're city parks, but maybe that's kind of more unique. So anyway, they really tried to hone in on what are the priorities that make the most sense for Snoqualmie. That alone was a huge amount of work. And then they brought that to this committee and then through us onto the council to buy off on all this. So now what they do is when they do what Mr. Hornsby is talking about, which is go through that competitive funding application process and they evaluate what's being asked. And some organizations will say, hey, I'm going to do some of this and some of that. They'll look and say, well, actually, that's already covered. So either we don't need you to do that, we just need you to do this, or hey, organization, actually, we think this is well covered already, so we're going to recommend no to you. We think that would diffuse the support, not multiply it if we did that. So, but they're very, very thoughtful. They don't just automatically say no. They go through this process. How do we achieve those 4 funding priorities? So the amount of work that's being done by this group is, first off, very high quality, in my opinion, very thoughtful and very thorough. These people put in so much time, and what that leads to is the recommendations that come to us. But, just like, say, when the Planning Commission does a ton of work before they send something to us, this group does too. And I think it's worth us all remembering that and being aware of it, especially when we have new council members, right, who may not have seen that in the past. So that's sort of why I'd asked for this presentation. But I think just realize how big what you're looking at is. Those were not easily arrived at things. There's a lot of work. And by the way, I believe that each cycle, by the way, they don't split the money 25%, 25 to 25%. They think about what percentage of the money should go for each of those priorities. They kind of revisit the priorities. So this is an ongoing kind of living set of priorities that you just be aware of how big that is. So I think you've got your computer back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm connected.
I raised
again.
my hand when I'm chair. So sorry, I missed the very beginning of this, but my understanding is that also some of those larger cities actually have programs within the city government to provide some of these things as well. So that'd be one of the big differences between, say, Seattle and us. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly true. And I use Seattle as an example to try and make a sort of almost being facetious. I was just trying to make a blatant, look, it's not the same. I was just trying to make that point. But just so you know, they looked at cities like us who outsource their human services. They don't have human services staff of their own. So they very much were looking at how do people go about doing that then? Because now you're reliant upon organizations in the community to accomplish what is really a goal of the citizens of the city. So they were very much focused on who does that best, how's that done best, and then trying to emulate that.
So you're saying that even among those cities, at least at the time, they didn't have these kinds of priorities listed out, at least as explicitly.
Some do,
Okay, so
some don't. Some are sort of had the feeling of a bit of a cookie cutter, like they just, they didn't feel tailored to that city, but we're not that city. So maybe that's unfair from a distance to say, but they really tried to go through that and kind of come up with a sort of best in class based on looking at what everyone else was doing. So they didn't copy what others were doing. They tried to use that to inform kind of what therefore do we think would be the best way of doing it. But they certainly used, I will say, those particular titles, I don't think you'll find those titles anywhere. And those titles really, I think, reflect what our group was saying, well, what matters here, right? So you'll see the same concept, just with more standard generic wording, right? Food subsidies. Well, food to eat and roof overhead. They're trying to make it personal. It's about the people of our community being able to eat and have shelter. Mm-hmm. So they tried to, it just, I think even their wording kind of reflects how personal they were trying to take this.
Right. It seems more person-centered than program-centered.
Exactly. It's all about outcomes. What outcomes can we achieve for our community, as opposed to, certainly if you have staff, you tend to think about, well, I have a staff that does this and the staff. So you start to think about it from that perspective. Mm-hmm. Or you could even think about it. And one of the things that we're worried about is, well, we've got this organization or that organization, and they focus on this. Well, let's not just take what they decided to do. They have a role, but let's start scratch. What are we trying to do now? How did they fit into what we're trying to do? They were trying to come up with that approach.
Thank you for that history lesson.
Yeah. So, but it's really worth knowing so that when these guys come forward, you truly realize how much is going on. These are not lightly arrived at recommendations they make to us. And I think Mr. Hornsby's you're going to talk about the review process that they then do
For accountability.
Yes.
Yes.
Because this is huge too. Some other cities do it, many do not. We were not really doing this much. Why? Because we had staff doing it and they only have so much time. Mm-hmm. And so this committee stepping in and helping with this has brought some hands to the process, and many other cities our size don't do this. So this is fantastic to hear about.
Yeah, so as Councilmember Mayhew said, a lot of smaller cities, they don't have the funding or the budget to employ human services staff. So we work with community organizations, enter into contracts with them to provide those services to the community. But I believe even cities as large as Seattle, they have some pretty significant contracts with community organizations as well. So it's not necessarily that this approach isn't necessarily unique to Snoqualmie, but the funding priorities obviously are, the advisory committee is, and so on. So those funding priorities, an organization, in order to receive funding for each biennium, they need to meet one of those 4 funding priorities. So up on screen right now are the 13 organizations that we fund for this current biennium. You can see the name of the organization over there towards the left-hand side of the screen, the funding priority that they meet within the middle there, and then the funding amounts for each year in 2023 and 2024. The total funding for this year is about 290,000, and then the total funding for 2024 is about 298,000. So together for the biennium, we fund human services to the tune of about $589,000 per year. Rest assured, the funds that you saw on the previous screen, those are not all just given out at once. We have this process that we call accountability forms that we ask each organization to 4 times per year to give the city just a little update on what has happened for the previous 6-month period. So in order to receive the next funding installment, the next paycheck, they need to prove that they have been following along with the scope of work in their contract correctly and to the liking of the advisory committee and city staff as well. So we have the first funding installment is based on application at the beginning of the biennium, and then every installment thereafter, 4 different ones are predicated on a successful submission of accountability form. And then, as I said, once the advisory committee meets to review those forms, usually in the month of January and July, or the month thereafter, they approve those forms, and then I arrange for the checks to be sent to the organization so that they receive their funding for the next 6-month period. So unless there are there any questions so far? I have a plan to just run through an example of an accountability form that we received for this past period, just to give you an idea of some of the information that we collect. All right, so I reached out to the Mount Si Senior Center to let them know that we were going to use their form as an example at this meeting. They're usually really great about providing lots and lots and lots of data and information for us. They're definitely one of the more detailed submissions that we see every 6 months. So I thought it'd be a good example to show this evening. So this is our accountability form. We send out just a template in Word to make it easy on the organizations to fill out. And up at the top, we ask for the name of the organization, the funding amount for the current year. In this case, it's a little under 33,000 for the senior center. The next question, we ask them to provide a budget of the human services funds for that previous 6-month period. We provide a table, ask for just some kind of general expense items. We're not looking for, like tiny expenses down to the item. We want to make it as simple as possible for these organizations to fill out, because the goal is really to make sure that these services are being offered. We want to make it easy on them. So we have these general categories that the senior center has filled out here, and then the amounts that they spend on each category. You'll notice in the total column, that's a bit more than what we have given them for that past 6-month period. And basically what they're trying to portray here is that they spend more offering services to Snoqualmie residents than what we offer them in funding for for this past 6-month period or for the biennium. So usually
just therefore pointing out that they provided those from other funding sources, not
Yes.
from us.
Correct. Good correction there. So usually we'll ask them to just specifically hone in on city funding, just to, because that's what we want to report back to you on, not necessarily funding other funding sources, what the city's money is going to.
Well, just on that, I would find it almost kind of weird if, let's say, the final dollar amount was the exact number that we gave them, and then they say, yes, that is exactly everything that we did.
Mhm.
It's like, you spent that exact amount on food or whatever, right? I would actually personally, if I were reviewing this, it would offer more evidence that it was legit if they did go over the budget that we allocated and they just said that other amount was covered by something else.
So some other organizations will kind of just, they'll only report on city funding, but you can kind of infer that, you know, if they spent all the funds, it's not like they just stopped there, you know.
Right.
So kind of along those same lines that you were just saying. So so in this next question, number 4, we asked them to provide some narrative on the budget for that past 6-month period. So the way that the Mount Si Senior Center has chosen to do this is that they provide a table with some of those different categories that you saw in the budget section. They have listed in this first column or the second column over here, the check-ins that they estimate having for the year. So these are their goals. In this column, they have how many check-ins they've had year to date. So through half the year, basically. The percentage of where they are in meeting these goals in this middle column here. And then these are approximate values of what they request in funding from the city of Snoqualmie to provide each of those check-ins for Snoqualmie seniors in this column here. And then this is the total funding amount broken up by each of those categories for the biennium. So this equals the $32,500 or so that we gave them to provide services for this biennium. They also provide a little bit of commentary towards the bottom. One thing I wanted to point out is that they talk a little bit about what they call their unsubscribed or undersubscribed areas. So in this case, they're talking about fitness and fall assessments, and they're identifying that they haven't had as many check-ins through the first 6 months of the year. But they let us know that the reason for that is that most of those check-ins are occurring later in the year. So they still expect to meet that goal, but it may show that, you know, they haven't provided so many check-ins to this point in the year. Number 5, we ask what percentage of clientele that the organization serves has a 98065 zip code. So it's the primary zip code for the city of Snoqualmie. You can see, you may be a little concerned to see that this is 16%, but it's to be expected, actually. So when you think of older residents, senior citizens, many of them are mobility impaired. So they're either unwilling or they just can't meet, or they can't go outside of their community to access services, to make appointments, you know, run simple errands. So the Mount Si Senior Center, being one of the only senior centers in the Snoqualmie Valley, even though we are a neighboring city, we're a few minutes away, that still may be a few minutes too far for some seniors to go. But even though they have a lower percentage of Snoqualmie clientele, they're still using this money to fully fund all of the Snoqualmie residents that do go to the senior center. And they're actually spending more money from other funding sources on those seniors as well from this city.
George, would it also be correct that part of this is because Snoqualmie has one of the lowest percentages of elderly residents of any of the communities in Washington, And that's not true of the rest of the draw area for Mount Si Senior Center, which is unincorporated King County and North Bend. So I don't know actually if that's all their draw area. Maybe they go down to Falls City. I don't actually know, but the point is, I think we're just have a much smaller percentage of our population that is in that age group than surrounding communities have. Is that also correct?
I wouldn't, I mean, I could check with the senior center to get their take on it, but I do believe that, you know, plays a part in, you know, how many clients from the community that go to the senior center. It would definitely depend on age ranges. But you are correct. The city of Snoqualmie does have a larger, younger population in compared to the senior population here. So one thing to note based on that comment is that the senior center is looking to do a community assessment. So they're currently looking for funding to complete that. It's basically a way of seeing you know, what the needs are in the community for senior services, and then you know, seeing how they can meet those needs. So they're in the process of putting out an RFP to have a consultant conduct that assessment for them so that they can kind of target different needs in the community and better serve the community.
Another thing that I could imagine is if let's just say that 16% were from, I'm just gonna pretend that it was the city of Snoqualmie. I know it's not the zip code, but pretend. And then another 20% were from North Bend, and another 3% were from Carnation, right? Whatever it is, right? If every community said, well, that's not really enough to justify funding, then eventually going to end up in a situation where they can't float the program at all, right?
Mhm.
So it, I think, would behoove us to help fund the program, even if that means that we're funding more than just our citizens, because those citizens do need that program, right? So there needs to be a program in existence for them. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more. Councilmember Johnson, 100% agree with that. I would point out, though, that in fact, our funding, as this report shows, actually comes up short of funding just our residents alone, let alone we're certainly not contributing to any other out of city residents. We're actually, you know, relying on funding that Mount Si Senior Center goes and finds on their own. So but I nonetheless, I agree with your point. Regardless, you know, even if we were, I'd be happy for the reasons that you said.
So the next question that we ask, number 6, we don't necessarily want to just collect data. We like to see, you know, a bit of the human piece of it, kind of a personal story. So the example that Mount Si Senior Center gave to us for this past 6 months is that they had a client who got involved in their Tea at 3 program, which I believe is kind of a tea party at 3 p.m. And so
That was golfing.
so she, thank you. So she has been baking up lots of yummy treats for her friends at the senior center throughout this program. And so she's putting her time to good use and, you know, making people happy with her baking skills. So I think that's pretty cool that they've been able to get her involved and also let us know about that as well, to kind of see some of these more personal aspects of what this funding does. And then this last question, we kind of just offer an opportunity for the organizations to tell us about any sort of events or, you know, new partnerships, initiatives, you know, other new funding sources that they've identified. And the Senior Center has chosen to talk about their East Indian celebration. So they are working to increase education on different cultures and making sure that all residents of all different cultures are being involved in their programs. So it's a great thing to see. So that's about all that I have. Oh, so they do identify a few things at the bottom. So Senior Citizen Month was in August. Senior Center Month is in September. From time to time, they'll reach out to the city to ask for a proclamation. So we, we always oblige if that happens, want to support them in any ways possible. So just a couple more ways that, we can help get the word out on these different initiatives and kind of promote the senior center as a human services partner of the city. So I think that's about all for this accountability forum, and about all I have this evening. Kind of just wanted to give you an example of what we collect, and if you have any questions, I can do my best to answer.
I don't have any further questions.
Yeah, so my question to two of you is, so this, the recommendations of this group become particularly important to the council once every 2 years at budget time, which is a time that council's full of doing tons of things because the budget's giant and complex and lots of things going on. So, my question, I guess, is something like this useful as an update to the full council? And if so, maybe doing that this sort of off budget cycle timing might be a good idea. But maybe you could think about if you want this presentation to be done to the full council, so they're kind of refreshed in their understanding, or maybe do it closer to budget time. I don't know, but I just, maybe something to think about.
Yeah, I think that I do find value in this for sure. I would wonder if we should wait until January when the new council would be seated, since they're going to be the ones that will be dealing with the budget. That's kind of my first reaction to that.
I think that'd be a good time to do it as well. So that they are brought on and then they know what's happening and how it's being monitored as well. I do think it's really helpful. I was also very surprised, just as a complete aside, that Mount Si Senior Center started helping people at age 50. I was very surprised at how close that actually.
Wait a minute.
The team might be nice though.
Yeah, so staff maybe make a note to give the presentation to full council maybe in January.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
From committee? No, okay. Then the next item is, scroll up, is the Planning Commission Land Use Goals and Policies recommendation. I see that we have Planning Commissioner and Chair Maruziak here to give us a rundown of what the Planning Commission has been working on. Did Community Development Director Arteche want to do any sort of preamble to that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The Planning Commission has been working steadily for many months on the city's comprehensive plan. A lot of the work kicked off in early fall last year when the commission, as well as the council, received training from the Department of Commerce to embark on this effort. Our first element has been reviewed and moved through the Planning Commission, and that's the land use element. And we have our chair, Maruziak, here to share with you the results of their effort and next steps.
Thank you. Thank you, Community Director. And as Community Director mentioned, Community Director Arteche mentioned, we spent a lot of time wading through a whole lot of detail. There's a whole lot of detail up there. And what I'm going to ask is that I could share my screen, because I've got both these copies, because sometimes you got to get in the weeds because we're doing something that goes between now and 2044. What I'd suggest I do here is present to you top level. And then if you want to dive in, go dive in. Is that a little better? Might be a little bit better. Let's see here. All right. Okay, so again, all of the detail is here, and if they've seen, if anybody's, so you guys have seen this,
Yeah.
you've seen all the detail. Okay, so let's talk then about the top level. It's so good you've seen this. Number one is to maintain the character and attractiveness of the city for the new development. Again, there's a lot of specific things here. The city's federally recognized historic preservation district, the design review process, appropriate lighting standards, but ultimately it's maintain the character and attractiveness in the new development as a goal and a policy. I think that's pretty straightforward for land use. The second one is preserve the story in Snoqualmie history, and recently got a lot more passionate about this particular point. It turns out that we were debating the amount of visitors to the falls. I looked up Snoqualmie Falls in Wikipedia, and there's a little narrative about Snoqualmie that I kind of bristled at, which was not about the story and the history of the logging and the trains and the guy going on a tower to see the silhouettes after Pearl Harbor to make sure no Zeros were heading toward our naval bases. Instead, it was about basically overdevelopment or irresponsible development, which we got to kind of bristle at. We have to look at Wikipedia for that. So I think it's important. I think it's crucial that it's not only in the plan, but we, actively preserve and defend our story and our history. All right, because it's pretty rich, and it's something that we got to have a lot of pride. So definitely have a lot of passion about that. And it talks about it here. One of the things it talks about: pursue grants and technical assistance to assist property owners for preservation. One example of that would be for land use is to try to get a grant to preserve the Woodmen, to make it a must-see event, make it a must-see place as much as the falls are right now. And the reason I point that out is, again, when my father-in-law visited, saw the falls, looked around, he was trying to get an idea of Snoqualmie. The Woodmen was still open. We went in there, saw the old saloon and whatnot. He goes, I get it. I get it now. I see what the city's about. I think we need something like that. Maybe not that, but something like that. And that's under the section of preserve the story and history of Snoqualmie. Number 3, pursue annexations that implement future land use designations. I know this might be far out, but again, the comprehensive plan will go to 2044. This is the 2013 comp plan. And you look at the areas that they had put out in that time. We certainly have a chunk of land outside the UGA, might not be up for annexation now, but who knows what's going to happen in 8 years or 15 years. So it's important to have the annexations that implement the future land use designation still in the comprehensive plan. Encourage nodes to have features, civic, jobs, transit, residents. Again, there's a lot more detail in that. We actually debated this a bit because the word should was in there. We're debating should and shall, which if you think of like the Better Way area having the same types of things as the Ridge or historic, you realize it needs to be encouraged, the nodes. But the idea is that whether you're in historic downtown, you have access to the same things that the Ridge has, the same things that the city has to offer in other places as well. And Meadowbrook is probably an underserved area. And then upcoming in the future, the mill site will be another interesting thing to make sure that you don't have it just as a single thing, like an outlet or retail, but it has all these things together. The 5th is to manage development within the floodplain, not floodway, the floodplain, to make sure that it is elevated and at the right locations, et cetera, and make sure that any upgrades, et cetera, are within those categories. That has to be part of our plan. 6, encourage quality residential areas that include low-income households. This, again, has to be part of the plan. I think there's an initiative right now to take a look at existing land within the city and see if some affordable housing can be built. They use the phrase low and extreme low household. I think that's going to be a challenge, but again, it ought to be part of the comp plan. They're always open to see what we can do for the workforce or low income housing. And then develop the local economy. That is, make sure the residents can spend money here, make sure they can eat here and have fun here, make sure there's jobs for both the residents and folks to come out. And tourism, I think there's a lot of, wide open areas there. And again, it's not specific here, but one of the things that we were chatting about is I run by the ice rink, and that place all summer we've been running, just practicing. And I'll tell you, that place is full around the clock. And I thought it was all hockey, but apparently the figure skaters are competing with them in terms of how they fill that place. And I'm thinking, wow, it would be cool. I mean, I know in the grand opening, there was a big deal there, but it'd be very cool if we could pull some tourism, not just for the historic nature, but something even new to the city. Again, all this, it'd be nice that for the land use, for the goals and policies, it's got enough weeds, enough detail that we can go ahead and pursue things like that. And then the needed institutional utility land uses, everything from the city hall to, things we have for power to the wastewater treatment plant, all these things that we got to do them within the regulations and do them well. So that is the top level. And we certainly can dig in the weeds. I think you've seen the weeds here. I was thinking, because we were doing a little bit of pairing, I was thinking maybe we do need to pair it, but these weeds might be important, this amount of detail for a plan that has to last for 20 years. So that's why they're there. But I think having the top level helps out. Any questions? Yes.
I have a request, I think, see if committee members agree with this or not before anyone does anything with C, but just before I make that, just thinking about your, what you just relayed to us about the ice rink. One thing that might help is if things like our signage was updated. So people going to the ice rink still see city signs with arrows to restaurants named that haven't existed in our city for years. And so it might be nice to get some of that updated right now, because those people don't even know about the restaurants we have right now, because they're being pointed to places that don't exist. So anyway, side point.
If I could just add to that, I mean, we reviewed and are still going back and forth with the EDC, exactly that stuff, signage and kiosks and things like that. But you're right. We all recognize that we need signage. We need a lot more signage.
Yep. And probably the signage we have probably needs some of it.
Yeah.
Needs to be fixed. Anyway, because, someone goes looking for affinities and can't find it. And they just anyway, whatever. Didn't want to belabor that, just meant to mention it in passing. Here's what I think I want to request, see if this resonates at all. The Planning Commission has done a lot of heavy lifting. Some of that Mr. Maruziak just alluded to and walked us through some of that. And I know he just sort of cherry picked some of the fun parts to talk about. There's probably 100x times what he just told us of similarly interesting detail that they went through. So as we go through this, I think the city council is going to rely on that work that was done by the Planning Commission. They're not going to try to repeat it, and I don't think they're going to try and review it in detail. They're going to rely on it, I think. So, and I think that sort of a concept is behind how Mr. Maruziak presented this. He said, let me start out with the main thing, and I'll sort of dig in where you might have questions. My thought is, let's try and facilitate that for the whole council and for the rest of the process between now and when we adopt an updated comp plan. So how? What am I suggesting? My suggestion is, although something like this might also be part of it, my thought is the actual recommendation, the actual priorities that they've sent to us.
Mm-hmm.
My thought is maybe ask for two things. The first is, let's turn that into a red line version as compared to what is currently there.
I was going to ask for that too.
So right away we can zoom in on, okay, what are they recommending we change?
Yeah.
And then secondly, I think if we could have something that summarizes why the various changes were made. Now, some of them will be wording changes that aren't substantive. We don't need an explanation for every word they changed. But where there's substance to what they're recommending, maybe a summary, because while it'd be great to have Mr. Maruziak at every meeting that occurs between now and adoption, it's not realistic. It's not going to happen. So this document then becomes something that speaks for the Planning Commission when they don't have a representative here to speak for themselves, wherever here is. So I think those two things can be really helpful. And then maybe we review that, kind of ask any question, make sure it looks sort of complete, right? And then maybe pass that by the full council. And then maybe that's how we get to sort of council sort of happy with this element. Does that sort of resonate at all, or?
I always appreciate having a red line and being able to see where we came from, where we're going, and and the reasoning why.
Community Development Director, attention.
Thank you. I'd just like to add that we did not do a red line. We specifically did not do a red line because so much of the plan was outdated, obsolete, programmatic. we started fresh. I mean, we definitely looked at what was there. And we definitely were cognizant of policies that, you know, we felt were still applicable. But honestly, with the sheer amount of change that's gone on with Vision 2050 and all of the other laws and regulations that went into place that were introduced at our short course for local planning, we did not do a red line. This is a wholesale rewrite. That being said, I'm sure we could find ways to draw parallels and provide some information.
Or even just provide the old one so we can compare and go, oh my gosh, okay, this is a lot of really new stuff. Councilman Mayor.
Yeah, so I'm asking questions to follow up on what you're saying, not to challenge you. I'm fine with what you just said. I just want to sort of work with that.
Sure.
Let me just make a comment that the first thought that went through my mind is, wow, for something that's supposed to look forward decades, that in just one decade, it would basically become useless is interesting because it suggests this whole idea may be overly ambitious. Things may be changed too quickly, but okay, fine. We try, right? So anyway, I just had that thought of, wow, that surprised me, but okay, but let's work with that. So it sounds like even from your comments, you tried to take the concepts and this is my words, not yours, modernize them, update them, you know, in some way, make them relevant to today. So it sounded like you were saying you were mindful of them, but you really, this was the way to put it together rather than try to redline what was there. So that might be fine. So then maybe, and I think you just alluded to this at the end of your comments, maybe it's, look, you know, these are the major new concepts or significantly different concepts as opposed to what was there before. So maybe you're not doing it in the form of a red line because that wouldn't be useful to anybody, but you do it in the form of a summary so that we can read that summary and say, okay, here's what they meant to change. Let's just focus on that. Think about that. If we have questions about that, ask them, but then maybe that gets us to where, okay, got it. So rather than digging through, why'd you use this word or that word, we're sort of, okay, those were, we can just focus on what they try to do and try to buy into it or ask questions where we're having difficulty. So try and build on what they've done as opposed to, you know, sometimes we can come off like we're grading teachers, you know, grading papers in school, like we're the teacher, right? Oh, you know, and I think what we're really trying to do is grab what they've done and just understand it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then ask any questions if we have it, but not about why'd you use this word, just why'd you go with this concept instead of that concept?
Right, kind of staying at that higher level.
The higher level, right? Because we're relying on them to have done the deep dive, and we don't want to get into that. We just want to understand how they got to the high level things they got to. And the problem I have is with this, I don't know how to follow them.
How did they get
Yeah,
to this from what was before?
right.
Yeah, Councilman Christmas.
And I was just gonna say to the extent that the changes are driven by whatever the legislation is that's come down since then, requiring us to do certain things, if you can just flag like that is a legal requirement, then that will probably make our job a little bit easier too there.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And other changes were made to enhance the document as well that, you know, Chair Johnson could elaborate on. But for example, the Planning Commission merged the community character with land use. So the historic preservation and goals and policies like that now have been put into the land use element. It can
Nice.
easily stream through and find them. Some of the very programmatic goals and policies were flagged to actually implement into the municipal code. And, you know, this is a two-step process. You know, you've got the comprehensive plan, but then you've got to follow up after adoption with the implementing ordinance and other changes. And so, yeah, there were some things that were just driven by common sense, and other things that were driven by Vision 2050, by commerce, by King County. And so those are kind of where how we got to where we're at. But we do have a paper trail. It's, you know, we started from somewhere. It's just
Oh yeah,
redlining.
yeah, and just so there's no misunderstanding, I'm not claiming that you didn't do something appropriately. I'm trying to figure out how to get on board with you quickly as opposed to in a detailed kind of poking around way.
Oh, and I want you to be on board. So, yeah,
So we want to
Yeah,
just take
Chair
the
Bruce,
action.
yeah.
We want to summarize what I reflected, summarize the new concepts that are reflected in this plan as compared to the old one. And make sure they have the old one. So.
So to respond to Councilor Mayhew's idea of, there's this wholesale change, I think that is what's happened. I think that I've said this many times, and I'm going to say it again. We spent, really, if you want to go this far, we spent thousands of years as a species building cities a certain way, where everything was within walking distance. Everything that you need for the day is within walking distance. Maybe a city couldn't quite, manage to sustain a service that needs a much larger population. So maybe it's a day's horse ride away. Okay. That's how we did city planning for thousands of years. Then, less than 100 years ago, we said, okay, we have these new things called cars. They can take us to anything where we want to go within minutes to hours. And we started building our cities in that way. And within the last 10 to 20 years, and really more so within the last 20 years, we figured out that was a terrible mistake. And there are a million reasons why that was a terrible mistake. And I think that one of the main reasons to have a wholesale update is to say, look, building cities like that puts more cars on the road. It spreads out our city services so that it's far more expensive to maintain them along with the roads themselves. And there are all sorts of environmental concerns as to why we don't want to build cities in that way, et cetera, such that we want to then look at these alternative ways of looking forward to a vision 2050, et cetera, where we're trying to go back to a more sustainable form of city development. And yes, it's a very long process. The ridge was just built. We're not going to knock it down and rebuild it in a more sustainable way tomorrow. It's a long process to getting toward that. What they did with the ridge was they said, okay, we're going to call it mixed use. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make it not mixed use. We're going to have our area that's the business park, our area where we have the commercial, and then everything's going to be residential around it. That's not mixed use. You can call it mixed use, but it's not mixed use. So I think that, yeah, it is actually deserving of a relook at the whole thing due to those changing patterns, along with the affordable housing issue that, yeah, it was starting to emerge 10, 15 years ago, but it hadn't really hit the forefront like it is now. I saw a meme the other day that was a housing history where a house was sold for $150,000 back in 1990, and then 2020 it sold for 1.5 million. That's a faster escalation than inflation. So anyway, just saying that there are a lot of elements that have changed that I think are worth looking at. Yeah, Councilman.
You're just upset that wasn't your house. That's
Yeah.
No, I that's fantastic. I agree with all that. That's great. Switching topics.
Yep.
Just the only thing in any of your comments that kind of caught my thinking, and I'm not really looking for an answer in the details, more just a broad answer, and maybe it's something that it's an ongoing discussion, I think. But it's the topic of low-income housing, and kind of, I think certainly the 6 years I've been on the council, this has been something we've struggled with, and I think are still struggling with, which is what kind of low income, what do we mean when we say low income in Snoqualmie? You referred to a couple of categories of, that people use to kind of break down low income housing. So for example, very low income housing generally is something that not only is it very hard to do in a place like Snoqualmie, but it's probably very undesirable to do because there are no supporting services. Folks in those categories desperately need housing that's affordable, but along with that, they need a whole host of services. They need transit. They need a whole bunch of things, which just building the housing without those isn't going to serve that group very well. So, coming up with solutions for some of those categories is more than just the housing, right? And more than just what Snoqualmie can manage to do on our own. doesn't mean we shouldn't go after it, but I'm just sort of curious how that gets developed, because one of the things that's also true is just, low income housing way up to 80% AMI level is in very short supply in Snoqualmie. In fact, we have far more demand than we have supply of. And that's folks like our teachers and our police and firemen and our civil service workers and so on. At least entry level. So I'm just curious, did you guys get much into that, or is that really too much into the weeds for a comp plan kind of thing?
I think that'll be coming up with housing, which we're actually kicking off
Got it.
today.
Okay. So stay tuned.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there's some level of consensus in the council that it's those upper lower incomes that are where we seem to have the greatest need.
Yeah, just to
When
comment,
looking into the housing element.
a number of years ago when I was on the EDC, we were just so focused on Panorama. I mean, that was it.
Yeah.
And that's why the reason I keep bringing it up is I'm not sure, we did a study how many people from Snoqualmie actually live there. We couldn't set aside for teachers or local first responders that might be commuting over the pass. I mean, I think there's a lot we could do with lower income housing that we just need to peel the onion. So because Panama, I don't know what the city thinks about it, but I don't think it did what we thought it would do. I just don't think it. I don't think you have people working at the golf course and other places living in Panorama right now. So
I do realize that we're bumping into planning commission time here.
wow.
So I wonder if we could just real quick take a look at the comprehensive plan timetable. Yeah, the calendar and just sort of like as an FYI. Thank you, Commissioner Maruziak, Chair Maruziak.
Yeah, and just to summarize, we would come back with some of that supporting documentation that we just discussed to help bring the committee on board. Okay, great. We do have Ashley Ragg, our planning technician, to just kind of walk through the attachment in your packet on schedule, because these are going to be coming fast and furious.
Hello. As Emily said, my name is Emily. My name is Ashley. You'll see that this is the loose schedule of the different elements that will be going through the review process and making it to council. It's not 100% accurate. Recently, the economic development element has been extended back a little bit since it is getting sent back to the commission, and land use we're actually wrapping up right now, and then we're immediately starting housing. So a couple of these need to be adjusted with the more information that we've been given, but down the line you'll still see how capital facilities is going to be taking a long time, as well as transportation, which we should be starting here in the next couple months.
Yeah, I really wanted to point out here how staff and the various commissions are working to try to get this to us as early as they can next year, so that we aren't having to double up meetings with the budget. We saw what happened last year when we had too many pots cooking at the same time. So we're trying to avoid that. Any thoughts?
Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, since we are at the end of the agenda, I will go ahead and say that we are adjourned. Thank you very much. We are adjourned at 7:07.